Thank you, Mary, for giving me this opportunity and allowing me to join you for this conference. Let me give you a warning at the outset. I am not going to talk about very much about what the title of the keynote says, because like everybody, I think here, and many people in the country, we're all kind of consumed by the news of what the Trump administration is doing. And what effect it might have on all kinds of issues in the course of our democracy, et cetera. So I'm going to try to put things in a larger perspective about where we are on public lands at this moment in history, and what we might expect in the next couple of years, because I think that really overarches and frankly could dominate the specific subjects that you're going to talk about here in terms of healthy land. So some of this comes out of my book, and I want to kind of give you the very broad perspective to begin with. These are the public lands, the federal lands, and mostly when we're talking about livestock grazing and landscape health, we're talking about BLM and Forest Service lands, because that's where most of the livestock grazing takes place, and that's the green and the red. But I should note that actually livestock grazing occurs in wildlife refuges. It also occurs in a few national parks, like Point Reyes in California. And so livestock grazing is pretty doggone ubiquitous. So when we talk about the public lands and livestock grazing, we're really talking about many of them. Now, let me also do a very slight digression here. And if you look at this map, which is fairly typical of how the 50 states are portrayed, look at Alaska and look at the scale of Alaska compared to the lower 48. It's completely out of whack. Most people don't realize that. Alaska is actually more than twice the size of Texas. Here's a quick display of how big Alaska is. So when you're talking about Alaska, you are talking about an enormous amount of public lands, 225 million acres. And so anytime you talk about public land statistics, Alaska always skews them because of its size. And I'm going to say a few words at the end about Alaska, because I think it's going to emerge. The public lands in Alaska are going to emerge as a big national issue, I hope, in the next few years. Anyway, this is a vast amount of real estate, more than 600 million acres. And it's almost a third of the land in the nation. And these lands are generally held open for use by everybody, for wildlife protection, for watershed protection, for cultural, historic, scientifically valuable resources, providing recreational and other kinds of educational opportunities. So, I mean, you're all familiar with this, obviously, but most Americans aren't. And so when you put a map like this on the screen, most Americans say, I had no idea, that the federal government owned and managed all that land. How did that happen? And the reason they have no idea is because the idea that America celebrates private property, and America distrusts government, and America particularly distrusts the national government. And so the idea that the national government manages almost a third of the real estate in the country and holds it for everybody is just kind of doesn't fit. Now, how did it happen? Well, of course, it didn't just happen. It happened because of political decisions. This came through the political process. Members that we elect to Congress and presidents made these decisions to produce the lands that we see here today. The U.S. Constitution doesn't require this. It doesn't say anything that the United States has to hold and manage lands of any kind. So I wrote this book to kind of summarize the political decisions that produced this result. And that's really the core of the book. And one other really fascinating fact about this is that these lands are incredibly popular. Opinion poll after opinion poll for the last several decades all over the country, including in the West where most of these lands are found, people approve overwhelmingly of the United States holding and keeping these lands open for these primarily open space kinds of uses. And so from the perspective of history, and I'm taking the big, broad look here, from the perspective of history, these public lands are a political success story. They're showing the process working the way the political process is supposed to work. We're supposed to elect representatives who do what we want. Well, as far as public lands are concerned, we have elected people over the last 150 years who have produced this kind of result, and we love it. And so I think from a big picture perspective, particularly in the Trump 2 era, telling stories, success stories about politics is really important, because most people are now skeptical that anything good can never come out of our political system or out of the nation's capital. And so that was a major reason I wrote the book. Bob plugged his book. Let me just say, if anybody wants a copy of my big fat book, 2.9 pounds, it's a doorstop, let me know and I can send you a discount coupon. And one little bit of warning: it's very long and it's very dense, but it has very short chapters. I got very good advice in writing it, which was, doesn't make any difference how long it is. If you have bite-sized chapters, then people can kind of dip in and out of it. So I think it's really pretty readable. Now, so I have one slide in the book which tries to summarize how all this happened. Now, and the summary goes as follows. It was not until really about 1890 that the United States made a collective decision to really start holding on to significant amounts of land and manage them in the long term for the public interest. And that bold line there is the line of tracing decisions by acreage and years of the decisions to hold lands in the national interest. So starting about 1890, that first upward thing, that's the national forest system. And then in the 1930s, you had a big upward. That was the Taylor Grazing Act holding on to grazing lands, and then on and on. And the last big upward slope in the bold line is 1980, and that was the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which protected about more than 100 million acres, held and protected more than 100 million acres of lands. That's the bold line. Now, the dotted line are decisions to basically protect them from almost all industrial kinds of uses, mining, logging, and that sort of thing. And it also has a similar upward trajectory, but obviously somewhat less, because we protect fewer lands from intensive industrial development. So that's the kind of story, the decisions that produced those lines, or the story told in the book. And the story, there's some myths about this story. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to kind of try to explode some of these myths. And myths that the public lands historically, since 1890 or so, have been very divisive. And they've been very partisan. People line up on one side of the aisle or another. And that this has represented a kind of federal land grab over the wishes of states and local communities. All of those are myths. By and large, these political decisions, considered broadly, were bipartisan, were not a federal land grab, but done from the grassroots up with local support, and were not divisive, but the opposite, had the tendency to bring us together, not divide us. And let me also underscore, these were political issues. They were not scientific ones. Science has a lot to say about how federal lands are managed, but it doesn't make those decisions. The decisions are actually made through the political process. So science informs, and science can narrow the options, but science doesn't dictate the outcome. Even, for example, some of you know the Endangered Species Act, a very science-focused statute. It does not decide what gets protected or not. The political process decides how the Endangered Species Act is implemented. The key decisions are made by the agencies that administer the Endangered Species Act. So science doesn't dictate here. It's ultimately politics. And the same with law. Law establishes a framework and a process for deciding, and law can kind of narrow the options, but it too is almost never final. And I want to underscore that when I start talking about the Trump administration in a minute. There's another kind of myth out there, which is that most of these decisions were made by the executive branch, not by the Congress. And in fact, that is also a myth, because most of these decisions were made by Congress. Congress sometimes authorized the executive to take actions, but it was Congress that made it possible. Congress gave the president power to reserve lands in the national forest. Congress established national parks. Congress authorized the acquisition of land for wildlife refuges, et cetera, et cetera. And I should also emphasize this, which is really not that, excuse me, well appreciated, and that is that Congress has actually been more aggressive in recent years in taking control of this process and in making these decisions. And the best example of that is something called the Wilderness Act. In 1964, Congress created a whole new system of federal lands in which basically all kinds of intensive industrial activity were outlawed, and road building was outlawed. It's a very, very protective category of federal lands. Now, interestingly, when the Wilderness Act was going through Congress, the key player in the House of Representatives was this curmudgeonly guy from Western Colorado, Wayne Aspinall. Aspinall didn't like wilderness, but he knew the act was going to pass. But he insisted on one thing as part of that process, which was that Congress be the gatekeeper of the system. So not 1 acre goes into the national wilderness system unless Congress itself has approved it. Now, why did Aspinall do that? Aspinall did that because he understood well how Congress works. And the way Congress works is that Congress will not dictate how particular areas of land, public land, are managed in a particular place without the consent of the congressional delegation from that place. That's not written down anywhere. It's a custom, but it is a very powerful custom. And so Aspinall knew that acres would not be put into wilderness through the Congress unless the congressional delegation from that place approved it. Now, Aspinall thought that meant there's going to be relatively little wilderness because most local areas won't want it. He was badly wrong. Badly wrong. Here's the growth of the acreage of the wilderness system since it was adopted in 1964. And the most important thing here is that the trajectory is always up. And it means that presidents and Congresses of both political parties over time have put more and more land in wilderness. Now, the big upward jump in 1980 is the Alaska Lands Bill, because it put more than 100 million new acres into wilderness. But the upward jump in the early 80s, that was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan and the Republican Senate put more land into wilderness in the lower 48 states than any president before him or after him. So again, Aspinall's vision that grassroots politics would govern turned out to be true. He just didn't anticipate how much popular support there would be for the wilderness system. And in fact, the wilderness system, 64 kind of launched a whole series of congressional decisions about particular areas of public lands. Most of you have been terribly confused by looking at a map and saying, oh, there's a national conservation area, and there's a national park, and there's a national scenic area, and there's a national riparian area, and it's got all these labels. By and large, they come from Congress. They are the result of specific decisions by Congress to protect particular areas, primarily from industrial kinds of development, mining, logging, and the like. And this has all happened across all 4 agencies. So it doesn't make any sense anymore to think about a particular agency as emphasizing forestry, logging, the Forest Service, BLM logs. Particular agencies don't have wilderness. All of them have wilderness. All of them have managed tens of millions of acres of wilderness. So the distinctions among these agencies has been blurred quite a bit. And this is captured in this. The left is the original logo of the Bureau of Land Management when it was founded in the 1940s. And it was then called the Bureau of Livestock and Mining because basically that's what its primary emphasis was. Well, that's changed, and the logo on the right is the modern Bureau of Land Management, and it manages tens of millions of acres of land in wilderness and conservation areas and these other kinds of protected areas. And it should go without saying that when Congress does this, Congress almost never changes its mind. That's why the arc in these charts is up, is always up. That's almost never a retreat. It's almost always holding, acquiring more land, protecting more land. And it's popular, as I said. The opinion polls show that it's popular. Okay, well, what about, let me talk about the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. Because I think where we are with the public lands in the American political landscape is at kind of a pivot point, perhaps. And so when we talk about the agenda of this conference of, resisting exploitation and restoring the landscape, we have to consider the larger perspective of what's happening with the second Trump administration. So let me give you just a couple of minutes on the big picture, not focusing narrowly on public lands. And I won't mince words. Overall, I think the Trump administration is mounting a gigantic, across-the-board assault on the American political tradition, sweeping power grab by the executive, by the president in particular, unlike anything we have seen since the Civil War. I think without question, what's happening in Washington these days is the biggest amount of change and tumult and controversy, far beyond what anybody, including me, thought was actually possible even a few years ago. It is a seismic shift, what is happening. And where it goes from here, obviously we don't know yet, but lots of things are on the table. Now, how did this happen? What kind of societal and cultural changes have made this kind of presidential power grab possible? Well, one is maybe underappreciated, the rise of money in politics. The Supreme Court in 2010 decided that that dollars were speech, and that Congress could not regulate political contributions by corporations and by individuals, and gave it a constitutional protection. And that unleashed a vast amount of money into the political system that we've never seen before. And it's growing. That builds on something else that has been happening in the last 30 years, and that is a dramatic rise in income inequality. The richest handful of people control a vast amount of the nation's wealth. And that's been increasing over the last 20 to 30 years. So there's a vast amount of money sloshing around in the system, primarily from the small percentage of very wealthy people, while everybody else is sort of at the bottom suffering. That vast amount of money Trump has control of. That's why none of the Republicans in Congress will cross him, because he's already raised $500 million, is probably going to raise $1 billion to spend in political contributions in the 2026 midterm campaigns. And that's why you'll see occasionally sort of independent, somewhat independent-minded senators like Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who's very thoughtful and very independent. And she was quoted a few weeks ago as saying, "We're all scared to death of Trump." Scared to death. That was her quote. Because he doesn't hesitate to use money to get his way, and he's succeeding. And you can see it every day in the lack of real debate inside the Republican Party. Then there's a change in how most people get their information about the political system and politics. And I'm talking about the rise of social media, the fact that most Americans get their news now from specialized sources. And this was captured, I think, in the first Trump administration, right at the beginning. Maybe you'll remember there was a big debate on Inauguration Day in 2017 about how big the crowds were in the Washington Mall. And Sean Spicer, who was Trump's first press secretary, was looking at the slides of the crowds on the Mall, which was sort of half vacant compared to previous inaugurations, and saying, "Oh, this is the biggest crowds ever." I mean, clearly a falsehood. And Chuck Todd, a media guy, confronted Kellyanne Conway, who was Spicer's assistant, and said, "How can Spicer say this? How can he show the slide of the mall half full of people and saying it was the biggest crowd in American history?" And she said, "Oh, those are alternative facts." You may remember the phrase alternative facts, which is sort of fiction, another word for fiction, but called facts. That's how that has spread throughout the culture. Truth doesn't matter that much anymore in terms of how people talk about politics and political issues. And that is a tremendous, tremendous problem. Coupled with that is the ongoing erosion of science in our culture. And you can see this accelerate under Trump, too, who's trying to hollow out the national government science capability. We just don't have the respect for science that we used to. That obviously has implications for public lands. And there's a breakdown in the norms that govern relationships across the different parts of the political system. Separation of powers, checks and balances. And then there are two other factors going on that I need to mention. One is Congress is not completely out of it. Congress has to do some things. It has to pass a budget. They're wrestling with that in Congress right now. But Trump is dominating that process, and I think will continue to dominate that process. And then you have the courts. The courts have a role to play. And there are a couple hundred lawsuits that have been filed about various things that Trump is doing. Frankly, I am much more skeptical than many of my colleagues that the courts are going to have a huge impact here. I think that for a lot of reasons, the legal process can be slow, can be cumbersome, proceeds very incrementally, courts sidestep many issues, and the outcomes are often difficult to predict. And the courts are much more conservative than they were even in the first Trump administration. There are many more conservative judges. And so bottom line is, I don't think the courts are going to, I think the courts will have an impact, but I don't think they're going to kind of bail out the system. And that they're not, cannot be relied upon. And so that's another big problem. Okay, so now Trump and the public lands in particular. Mostly what we've seen so far since Inauguration Day in January is a lot of a blizzard of executive orders, dozens and dozens of them, kind of flashy pronouncements, we're going to unleash the industrial potential on public lands. We're going to drill, baby, drill. We're going to open everything up to industrial exploitation to the fullest extent possible. Interestingly, all of these orders, thousands of words, never mention climate change, hardly ever mention the environment. Now, obviously, most of these orders, they're sort of like New Year's resolutions. You know, they sort of offer promise, but may not be implemented. So we can't take them at face value. But many of these orders do focus on very specific things. There was one in March that said that the Forest Service and BLM shall expedite timber harvesting on public lands wherever possible. There have been lots of orders that call for streamlining and exploiting exceptions and loopholes in environmental regulations, like NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Endangered Species Act. And there's orders calling for more lease sales and orders that exploit the various laws that allow presidents to do drastic things in emergencies. So Trump is exploiting the concept of emergency all across the board, and not just on the environment and public lands, but across the board. Whether the courts rein that in or not, I think is really an open question. And we are now beginning, weeks after the inauguration, to see stuff happening on the ground. The Interior Secretary just did a fast-track order on a uranium mine in southeast Utah, you may have read about. And they've called for expediting geothermal permitting and things like that. But now, let me shift us slightly, at least to the, if not positive, at least a glimmer of perhaps hope. Remember that first Trump administration downsized the two large national monuments in southern Utah, the Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase. Many expected Trump to, first day in office, the Biden restored those monuments, and many expected Trump to, on day one, to undo that and to shrink them again. That hasn't happened. And it's an interesting question to think about. Why hasn't that happened? Because many people thought, well, of course, Trump 2 will start where Trump 1 left off, and let's downsize, shrink those monuments again. Why hasn't Trump done that yet? There have been kind of stories come out and leaks come out that they're considering it, and they may do it next week, and they may not, and all kinds of stories. But nothing has happened officially yet. Why is that? I think at least part of the answer is that Trump people are not totally insensitive to public opinion, and they understand that public opinion actually, even in places like the state of Utah, generally support those monuments and don't want to see them downsized. And so I think the Trump people are sort of taken aback a little bit and stepping back and saying, well, maybe we should do this, but maybe not. So we'll have to see. So I think they at least have some ear to public reaction. They're not insensitive to it. And so I think we should take heart from that. Because that allows the pressure to be intensified, particularly at the grassroots, to potentially rein in some of Trump's kind of worst instincts here. But now, another thing to consider is if one takes I'm not a real expert on opinion polls and the like, and looking at election results, but if you look at the 2024 election results, it was a close election, and it was quite clear, I think, that quite a few people who voted for President Trump did not do so with any expectation that he was going to make massive changes in public land policy. I just think that was outside the scope of what people were thinking about. And so that suggests that it is important to consider messaging on these issues that reaches out to those MAGA-oriented people who support what we support in terms of healthy public lands, and get people like that to speak up and say, no, this is not what we voted for, and we oppose taking steps to exploit and industrialize the federal lands. So now another curious thing that is worth a mention, and that is since 1980, the sort of right-wing Libertarian Heritage Foundation has every 4 years published an agenda for the incoming Republican administration. And since 1980, every 4 years, that document, those recommendations contain recommendations for selling off or divesting the United States of significant amounts of public lands. They just have routinely said that. And by the way, we should sell off or transfer to the states significant amounts of public lands. 2024, what's actually called Project 2025, that was the Heritage Foundation report for the second Trump administration, was silent on that, did not say that. For the first time in 45 years, the Heritage Foundation did not endorse in any blanket way significant transfers of public lands. Again, why is that? Has the Heritage Foundation changed its historic position, that this kind of libertarian position that the government should not be owning significant amounts of land, should not be managing significant amounts of land? But what's going on here? Remains to be seen, but here's my assessment of what's going on. And that is, I think the Heritage Foundation has sort of woken up to the overwhelming popularity of public lands, and public lands being mostly protected and maintained as open to all. And they see that as a political loser. Does that mean they've changed their fundamental position of hostility to public lands? No. But what they've changed is the strategy. The strategy is, well, let's not just continue to bark up the tree of proposing divestiture and transfer of lots of land. Let's do something different. And the something different is this. Let's hollow out the federal land management agencies. Let's make it impossible for them to do a good job of managing the public lands. And as management of public lands deteriorates, and the public that enjoys those lands sees how they are being managed badly, the public then will change its attitude and say, well, we can't trust the federal government to manage these lands well anymore. And therefore, the remedy is to give the lands to the states or even to the private sector and let them manage it, and they'll do a better job. So I don't think the Heritage Foundation has changed its goal, but it has changed its strategy for getting there. And that strategy, the tip of that spear was Elon Musk and the Doge people. The idea of let's just strip the federal government of management ability, of science, of a lot of things it does that leads to a successful management of the public lands. Let's make it not work. So the message is the feds really can't manage these lands, and then so someone else should be given that opportunity. Now, this all suggests to me that things that the people who care about healthy public lands need to keep foremost in mind for the next couple of years at least, which is keep that threat out there. Keep the notion that many Trump supporters don't support this. They support the public lands. They don't support large-scale divestiture. They don't support hollowing out science and management ability, and that this is being driven substantially by the rich. front and center where possible. If you look at the public lands, the upward arc here, starting in 1890, that was a reaction to the so-called Gilded Age that Mark Twain named, which was where the rich, widespread income inequality, and the rich, the miners, the developers, the railroads, were interested in basically plundering the public lands, getting control of them, and excluding the public and managing them for their own profit. That was a significant driver in that first big push to hold and protect public lands. I think the same thing is happening today, and I think it has to be called out. That the levels of income disparity are greater now than they were in the latter part of the 19th century. That helped fuel that original drive. There's always some very wealthy people who want to crack at public lands, and we need to call them out and tell those stories. Some of you probably know about the so-called corner crossing case that's gotten a lot of attention in Wyoming. I think that story needs to be repeated over and over again, because what happened there was a very wealthy guy from North Carolina comes out to Wyoming, and he buys a ranch, private land, that is interspersed with public lands. And he closes off the public lands to public access because he threatens anybody who crosses the corners from one piece of public land to another that crosses his airspace on the corners that he owns. He threatens them with damages. In fact, a bunch of hunters went out with GPS, and they crossed the airspace from one piece of public land to another, invading his airspace, and he sued him for $8 million in trespass damages. The idea to exclude the public from public lands, that is the kind of stuff that needs to be called out. And you've seen that in other places as well. The Wilkes brothers in Idaho. And you see it also, and this is another area that I think deserves to get a lot more attention, and that is the changing character of livestock operators on public lands. The image of cattle grazers on public lands is a very heartwarming one to mainstream America. Working landscapes, multi-generational families, dirt under the fingernails, carving out a living, a modest living, on using public land, grazing permits, etc. They still exist, but they exist in far fewer numbers than they used to. And if you look at the identity of many public land grazing permit holders, they're not those multi-generational dirt under the fingernails types. They're quite different types. And the classic example I've been using recently is a couple of years ago in Montana's beautiful Centennial Valley that was mentioned earlier. A ranch, big ranch, changed hands that involved a couple 100,000 acres of grazing permits on Forest Service and I think some BLM land. The seller was the Koch brothers. The buyer, Rupert Murdoch and his wife. So Rupert Murdoch is now a public lands grazer. And he, there are quite a few others like him. I think those kinds of stories need to be told and hammered on and emphasized, that the use of these private lands in these scenic areas is driven by this wealth inequality and desire to take control of public lands, ultimately. Interior Secretary Burgum, very close to the oil and gas industry, he owns 2 homes and a bunch of property in the Yellowstone Club, private land area. He had a fundraiser there for Trump in the fall, last fall, that donors paid $100,000 to join. We need to tell stories like that because the public lands are and traditionally have been a kind of great equalizer, providing readily accessible opportunities for ordinary citizens to go out and recreate and be inspired by and learn at modest costs. And the move to the plutocracy and the concern that public lands could end up in the hands of relatively few, off limits to ordinary people, is a real one. The stories are now coming out. I mean, people are kind of getting on to this. I think there just needs to be much more emphasis. There was a story just a couple of days ago about a Doge guy who is actually running the Interior Department now. Secretary Burgum has kind of given him control. A guy named Tyler Hassan. He's a wealthy guy, and he's got all kinds of investments in oil and gas and crypto and all that kind of stuff. And he's actually running the Interior Department's day-to-day decision-making. And that has to be, again, called out, emphasized, scrutinized, publicized. It's always more, this is kind of a fundamental rule of politics, is always more influential to highlight corruption, hypocrisy, economic mismanagement, etc. That always works better than kind of earnest appeals to let's make the lands healthy. And I think, at least for the next couple, 3 years, that has to be the principal focus of everybody concerned about protecting healthy public lands. Okay, now let me do say a few words about livestock grazing and what this all means, what's going to happen in the Trump 2 administration. It's not been at the top of the radar screen, may never get there, but let me offer some thoughts on this. Conservationist advocates, people in this room, I think have made a lot of progress in recent decades in at least getting people engaged in the process of controlling and to some extent retiring lands from grazing. That turns out to be, as many of you know, quite a bit more difficult than it should be, because even if you can get the government to not renew a grazing permit or get the existing permit holder to relinquish it and turn it back to the government, making that retirement permanent is impossible under current law unless Congress says so. And a classic example of this actually happened in the first Trump administration. The Grand Canyon Trust, on whose board I serve, bought some grazing permits from willing sellers in the Grand Staircase and turned the permits back to the BLM and said, the livestock operator is leaving, and we want you to retire this land from grazing. BLM said yes, and then the Trump 1 administration came in and said, we changed our mind. We're actually going to issue the permit. So the money that the Grand Canyon Trust had raised to pay the departing rancher was wasted, essentially, because what it thought it was buying was retirement of this public land, and it didn't get that. Now, that's still up in the air as to what's going to happen there. But the problem of retiring public lands from grazing is difficult unless you persuade Congress to ratify, to approve it. And Congress sometimes does. If you look at the Owyhee in Idaho, the Boulder White Clouds in Idaho, the local congressman there legislated, put into law deals that retired permanently some of those lands from livestock grazing as part of a negotiated settlement. And there's been quite a few success stories like that, all done locally. Can you ever have a generic legislation that would deal with this problem westwide? Politically impossible, at least in the foreseeable future. Also, let me mention grazing fees. When I worked for Bruce Babbitt back in the early 90s, Babbitt came into office as Interior Secretary and thought, all right, we're going to reform grazing, we're going to raise grazing fees, we're going to bring grazing under more control. A big bust, a complete failure. Actually, Congress considered it, but then Congress didn't do it, and the effort failed. And that speaks volumes about whether it's worth spending a lot of time and energy on something like grazing fees. It turns out to be basically virtually impossible to give that idea political traction. Permit renewal process and the National Environmental Policy Act, environmental reviews of grazing permit renewals. Been a lot of time and attention and effort focused on that over the last 30, 40 years. It has been, my judgment, quite limited success. What has happened instead is Congress has exempted many grazing permit renewals from any kind of NEPA review. Again, showing the power of the industry and the reluctance of Congress to take it on head on. Grazing permit renewal and the Endangered Species Act. That's had some promise and been a lot of effort in this area. And maybe that can continue, but the Trump administration has indicated it's going to try to carve out from the Endangered Species Act any kind of habitat protection notion. And it may succeed in that. I will not put a lot of money betting on the courts to stop it. I think what the courts do with that is really up in the air. So I'm being a little, skeptical about. I'm very skeptical about generic solutions, getting something out of Congress across the board. I think history has shown for the last 40 years that's basically impossible. Can you make progress in local areas with a lot of intensive effort and negotiation and involvement of the ranchers? Yes, you can, and there has been success in that area. But you have to kind of lower your expectations about what is possible. Now, finally, kind of a tactical question. But in the end, remember, politics governs all this. It's politics. It's not science. It's not really law. And so the question for the immediate future for surviving Trump 2 is really about political strategy, about maximizing, enhancing, enlarging the political support and getting people to activate and demonstrate their political support for protecting public lands, including, as I said, and can't say this often enough, including MAGA supporters, people who voted for Trump for reasons other than public lands, and who would not support these kinds of efforts on public lands. Those people need to be engaged and to speak up and to demonstrate, because they will have tremendous influence. And that means, among other things, looking for allies, always. When you're talking politics, you're talking coalitions. You're talking about putting people, interest groups together that may not have exactly the same interests on every issue, but on this particular issue can be united to take a firm, strong position. That means backcountry hunters and anglers can be very powerful. Outdoor recreation businesses and employers. Quite interesting, actually, if you saw this, but recreational equipment, REI, big outdoor equipment manufacturer, very politically, economically powerful. When President Trump nominated Doug Burgum to be Interior Secretary, they endorsed him. REI said, yeah, he'll be wonderful for the job. Well, about a month ago, they withdrew their support. They expressed regret, basically, publicly saying, we're sorry we did this. We shouldn't have done this. That kind of thing can be very influential. Another very strong ally in the last 10, 20 years, and new to the scene of general public land management, is the interests of indigenous peoples, Indian tribes and the like. By and large, they are in lockstep with healthy public lands advocates for historic reasons. They invented the idea of ecological management, basically, over thousands of years, and they are becoming, across the board, more engaged in these issues involving healthy public lands, and that's been a really important and impactful development in modern times, and needs to be nurtured and expanded. Now, having said that, indigenous interests are often very strong allies, but not always. I spend a good deal of time on a bunch of Alaska issues, and I can tell you that in Alaska, the native groups are quite divided and fractured on a lot of this stuff. There's some historical reasons for that, some legal reasons, because Alaska doesn't have, it's got traditional tribes, but it also has native corporations under state law, which own a lot of land. And the native corporations under state law do not behave like tribes in many, traditional tribes in many situations. They're more profit driven and maybe more inclined to support petroleum development and that sort of thing. So they don't always agree among themselves. Then there's the strategy of friends groups, which is another thing that's really emerged much more powerfully in the last 20 years or so. And that is forming and having grassroots groups organized around a particular area and organized to focus on the protected public lands in that area and how to protect more public lands in the area. It's a way to cultivate citizenry to engage and to channel activism toward particular landscapes. Okay, so I guess to just underscore, I think the focus in the near term 2 or 3 years, to focus on generic reform legislation, like reforming the grazing regulatory process, I think is a waste of time, frankly. And the emergency we face, and I think it is a real emergency, we're really at a pivot point that if Trump can succeed in doing what he set in motion in doing, I think it's going to be very hard to recover, even when Trump leaves office, to recover and get back to where we were. Particularly the hollowing out of the agencies, the destruction of science and those things. You can't turn that back on like a light switch. To rebuild management capacity and expertise in the federal agencies is a multi-year process. And so if Trump, sort of destroys that, hollows that out in the next couple of years, it may take many, many years after that to rebuild to what we are. And that's why we're in this sort of grave danger, the need to focus on immediate action. Now, let me just say, I want to say one word, and this is kind of more personal than anything else. I'm just about the end. I do want to talk about Alaska a bit, because while Alaska doesn't have grazing lands, Alaska has a lot of federal lands, including about 75 million acres of BLM lands that are largely unprotected, that are not subject to the 1980 Alaska Lands Bill, and that are at quite grave danger of being exploited. And if you look at Alaska public lands and look at the rate of warming in the Arctic, things are going to be very different there in 20 to 30 years. You're going to have shipping through the around Alaska. You're going to open up a lot of areas that have been protected largely by their isolation. That isolation is going to disappear. And Trump and the developer types in Alaska see this coming very clearly. One of Trump's January 20th executive orders was called literally Unleashing Alaska's Resource Potential. And he listed about 30 things that he was going to do to exploit the public lands in Alaska. And so I think what we need there is a kind of a national engagement on protecting Alaska's public lands, because it's got some of the most stupendous open places on the planet that are vulnerable and growing increasingly vulnerable. Now, I mentioned earlier this congressional custom that Congress doesn't legislate with respect to areas of public lands in particular places without the consent of the congressional delegation. The one exception to that over American history was 1980, was the Alaska Lands Bill, because that passed as a result of a national grassroots campaign in the lower 48 states that overcame the opposition of the Alaska congressional delegation. And it did things like double the size of the park system, triple the size of the wilderness system, triple the size of the wildlife refuge system, et cetera. And the bill was called the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. And the reason it was called that is because Congress made a deliberate decision. These lands are in the national interest. Protecting these lands are in the national interest. So I think we need to revive that. And I think you're going to hear, I hope, a lot more about Alaska public lands in the next several years. Okay, I apologize for going on. It's great length about Trump and where things might be going. But let me stop there, and I hope we can have a discussion and continue throughout the day. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, John. So we're going to open it up for a Q&A, and I can bring a mic over to you if you have a question for John. Great.
I just wanted to ask you if a young person like myself who's in their 20s and 30s really cared about this issue and wanted to get involved, what advice would you offer them? How would you give them hope, or how would you motivate them to stay involved?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm probably not the best person to speak to 20-year-olds about, or 20-somethings about what to do. But I think the first message I think I would have is engagement is empowering. It's empowering to you. It's also, I think, political engagement, at the kind of grassroots level is a really, really important thing to do. And it can be very influential, but it involves, building coalitions and persuading people and a lot of one-on-one kind of conversations and that sort of thing. But like I said, in the end, what happens to these lands is decided by politics. It's not decided by science. It's not decided by law. It's not decided by anything other than how the political system responds. And so it's absolutely vital. And at a time like now, when so much is at play in the political system, it's extremely important to do. And it's empowering. I think it can have really positive personal effects as well. So that's kind of the overwhelming message, is just get out there and start engaging, particularly at the grassroots, maybe focusing on particular areas of public lands, because those can really energize you and give it drama.
Good morning. Thank you. Missing from that is 56 million acres of tribal land, technically federal land held in trust, right. Managed by the BIA and the Department of Interior. And it is in trust, and that doesn't include all of the land within the exterior boundaries. So that 56 million acres is about 9% of the total public land in the country, which is 2% of the land base of the U.S. Coincidentally, 2% of the population of the U.S. is indigenous, tribal. So I want to pick up on your idea of coalitions with tribes, and that land is held in trust. So the trust land that I owned, because I'm a ward of the government and considered a child, I'm not able to make decisions about my own land on my reservation without the help of the BIA. And boy, are they messing that one up for about 100 years. So the question is, and this wouldn't include Alaska because there are no treaty tribes in Alaska that have treaty purposes. If you were to identify two particular ways to coalesce with tribes on treaty purposes to protect and set aside lands, either for habitat conservation, for specific species, or just general protection. I mean, we have bear's ears as an example, but I'm thinking big. We're in an extreme time. We need extreme measures. Maybe we get 500,000 acres adjacent to the Yellowstone for habitat protection for various species, bison or whatever. What would your two biggest potentials for success be with tribes and treaty purposes?
I think, first of all, I taught Indian law for many years. It is the most complicated area of law out there. It's very hard to generalize about Indian law. So let me give that caution up front. But the most important thing, without question, is for tribes to be unified, because many areas, as you well know, many areas of land have ancestral ties with a number of different tribal groups. And if they're speaking with different voices, they lose influence, or they never gain influence, basically, if they're squabbling among themselves. So the first and by far most important thing, if you're working on protecting a particular area of public lands to serve the tribal objectives, is for the tribal interests who have an interest there to be unified. And that can be complicated, as you well know. Take time, a lot of negotiation, a lot of talking. But you saw it dramatically in the Bears Ears. The Bears Ears Monument was created by Obama in, 2016. The reason it happened, it would not have happened except the 8 or 9 different tribes that had interest in that land. They all got together and agreed upon an agenda. This is what should happen. And that made it possible for the president to say, fine, we're going to do this. If they hadn't done that, it would not have happened. So that's maybe the most important thing. I think the other thing is, the second thing I would suggest is that tribes that collaborate with non-native groups regarding a particular area of land, public land, if they collaborate, they can be very powerful, even in, I think, a Trump administration. So I think that, again, that involves a lot of talking, a lot of negotiation, a lot of give and take. But doing that before you go to the federal government and say, we would like this area to be managed primarily for wildlife, et cetera, whatever the agenda is, if it is the non-native interest and the native interest speaking on the same page, pursuing the same agenda, that really multiplies their influence and can be very influential. And as I said, let me give you an example. I worked on the Grand Staircase Proclamation, helped put that together back in '96. Tribes at that point were nowhere to be seen, in the sense that we did not reach out to them. They did not speak up and express an interest in this. It was all done without any kind of native involvement. Fast forward 20 years, Bears Ears, completely different. In that span of time, between the 1990s and the 2000 teens and today, native groups have become tremendously powerful politically, and shouldn't sell themselves short. If they can reach unity and can work out differences in advance. If they do that, I think the sky's the limit in terms of what can happen. Now, let me put a big caution there, because I think your next question might be, well, what about land back? What about transferring some public lands back to Native American groups? That can only be done legislatively. It takes an act of Congress to do, and where Congress has to act, that's where you have that local veto come into play. So even if Native American groups are all agreed, we want title to this land back, it won't happen unless you can persuade the local members of Congress that that should happen. Now, sometimes it does, but it takes a peculiar combination of circumstances. The tribes got, in northern Montana, got the bison range back by an act of Congress in whenever it was, 2018, I think, or something like that. They got that back because they had also worked out a water rights settlement with the state, and the water rights settlement was the vehicle for the legislation, and they tacked on the bison range to that, and it all worked. But it takes those kind of peculiar political circumstances for that to happen. So hope I've provided some answer.
Okay. We're going to take one from virtual. So the question is, about 30 years ago, there was a political decision not to transfer lands designated as national monuments to the National Park Service. In my 25 years of experience, I believe the National Landscape Conservation System managed by the BLM has been an almost a complete failure. What's your opinion?
I have a very long-range perspective of this. I worked on public lands and BLM lands for 30 years before the National Landscape Conservation System came into play, actually almost 40 years before it came into play. I think the National Landscape Conservation System, the BLM conservation lands, is a step forward. If you're most vitally concerned with livestock grazing, I can understand your skepticism and saying nothing has really changed, because most of the lands in the BLM conservation land system are grazed by livestock. So from one perspective, things haven't changed much. On the other hand, I think the lands in that system are by and large difficult to develop for other purposes, for mining, for oil and gas, even for road building, and other kinds of restrictions are easier. So don't let the livestock grazing lens, influence your complete view of what the conservation land system is about, especially compared to historically. So I think it is it a complete success? No. Is it a step forward? I would say yes. And does it have promise longer term benefits? Does it make it easier, for example, to work out locally negotiated deals to retire or restrict grazing in some circumstances? I think it's easier if those lands are in the conservation land system than if they're not. So that's why I say it is an incremental step forward. So I think it has been an advance. If you look at where BLM was in 1970 and compare BLM today, I think it's a substantially different agency. I think it is much more conservation minded than it used to be. So I will make that defense.
John, thank you. Amazing overview. My question for you is, do you think that the entities that want to exploit these lands are still very much set on taking over fee title ownership rather than, your example of the Wyoming ranch? Isn't that the best of both worlds? Because they don't own those interspersed lands, they don't pay property taxes on them, yet they get exclusive access to them. And there's a libertarian think tank in Montana that has called for the total liquidation of federal lands for 4 decades, is suddenly greenwashing its record. Wow, no, we're all about this. And my question is, isn't it almost better to just get huge contracts for logging, oil and gas, and yet not take ownership of it? Do you think that's what they want, or do you think they still, in the long run, want to actually take fee title ownership?
I think it depends. Some of them want just access and control, and fee title is irrelevant. What you're seeing, for example, now is, and this is pending in the congressional legislation and the budget legislation, is lowering the oil and gas royalty rates substantially, so that people who have oil and gas leases will end up paying virtually nothing. And they pay almost nothing in rent anyway, and pay very low royalties, and they'll have control of those lands. They don't need title. They have control of them, basically. And so I think in that situation, that's what they basically want. I mean, ranchers, it is kind of a myth that the idea that ranchers wanted title, always wanted title. If you look at the Taylor Grazing Act, 1934, which was the first time Congress legislated told the federal government to regulate grazing on the so-called unappropriated public lands, not the forest lands, but the BLM, the lands that became managed by the BLM. The livestock operators did not want title for exactly the reasons you mentioned. They didn't want title because then they got to pay taxes on it. Then they got to be subject to local control, et cetera. So all they wanted was control. All they wanted was access and control. And that's what the Taylor Grazing Act essentially gave them. And so they were perfectly happy with it. Once in a while, somebody would speak up and say, well, we would like to get title. But actually, the big livestock operator lobby, the permit lobby, always opposed that for the reasons you said. So title can be an objective in some circumstances. If I want to build a whole bunch of, retreats for wealthy people and sell them off in fee title, I want fee title to be able to do that. If I want to do another Yellowstone Club or whatever, or build a new town somewhere, I need fee title. Almost certainly need fee title to do that. But if I just want to exploit the grass or exploit the trees or exploit the minerals, then I don't really need title to do that. So you're right in that sense.
We have time for a couple more questions, if you're okay, John.
Sure.
Great.
Thank you. So I want to preface my question with a little bit of my own observation or bias. I think the authoritarianism that we're seeing from the Trump 2.0 administration is so dangerous that we're going to have to radically reimagine the tools that we use in defense of public lands, including land back and probably direct action. It was interesting, another tool that I see happening. It was interesting while you were talking, Ryan Busey sent a text talking about his group called Public Lands Warriors, targeting Republicans in swing districts in defense of public lands. My organization, Wildlife for All, is doing something similar. We're very small, but we're campaigning state level leadership to be courageous and step up in defense of wildlife and public lands. And I think all of these efforts are well and good, but as I mentioned, I think we have to be really bold. Science indicates that deregulation from the federal government just emboldens both illegal exploitation and legal exploitation. So I think with the gutting of the federal workforce, we are seeing like some irreparable damage about to happen, or is maybe already happening. So what I see is a need for organizations, donors to be stepping up and monitoring, organizing the public to monitor, organize, protect, and defend public lands. But the question that I always come up with is, how do we do that when we don't have Koch brother money, when we don't have Murdoch level money? Who's gonna step up? Is this a realistic plan? Yeah, I'm just wondering your reactions, and I guess this is a question to everybody at this conference, is do you agree that's necessary? Is it realistic? Who's gonna fund and organize all of this? And how do we do it when we're never going to have as much money as our opponents?
Well, you're right. You'll never have as much money as your opponents. That's sort of the given to start out with. But you have an agenda that has potentially popular appeal if you reach the right people, and that often involves sort of grassroots, ground level activism. And you know, I can point, and I'm sure you're familiar with some examples where that's happened. It was interesting. If you look at Montana, Montana was always kind of a, you know, very red place and very hostile to federal land management. Now Montana politicians, Republican politicians, are on the other side of that issue. The senator that beat Tester, Sheehy, I don't know if you remember, but early in that campaign, when Sheehy was going to run against Democrat Tester, and Tester was a big defender of public lands, Tester's people came up with some old things that Sheehy had posted online years earlier that had taken the kind of libertarian view of public lands and said they're terrible, blah, blah, blah. And that when that came out, Sheehy pivoted and ran the other way as fast as he could and said, I was wrong, I love public lands, and tried to neutralize that issue, and did actually kind of neutralize it. He was elected. But he has been a defender of public lands in the sense that when the Nevada and Utah Congress people put on the House budget bill, that proposal to sell off 500,000 acres of public lands, the Montana Republicans, Ryan Zinke, Interior Secretary under Trump 1, Sheehy, Daines, the other Republican senator, all said, terrible idea. We stand by our public lands. So Montana political establishment has kind of turned, and I think that can happen in other states as well. It's going to take a lot of, you know, hard activity at the grassroots level, and you'll never have the money, but there is some money available for this. It's just it will never be in the dollars that the right wing will have on this. So you just gotta, it's a slog. You gotta kind of keep at it, and I really appreciate what you're doing.
Hi, good morning. Well, first I have a comment for the young lady that was asking about how to get involved. And one of the organizations that I found is called Citizen Climate Lobby. That is a global organization, and there's a lot of opportunities for involvement. They have local chapters all over the place, and they do have groups that are dedicated to lands and forests. And then my question is, I don't understand how ranchers have so much lobbying power for grazing on public lands, because from what I understand, I'm always seeing, you know, ranchers saying that they can barely make ends meet. They get government subsidies, or from what I know. And yet they have so much power with Congress about retaining their right to graze on public lands. And I know you mentioned that most of the grazing allotments are for these big ranching corporations, and the family multi-generational ranching operations are a lot lower now. But what kind of difference are we talking about, and how much money, how much power